Welcome to InfoStream, your daily current. Unsure what to listen to? Turn to us for today's headlines. Stay informed. Israel and Hamas agreed to a Gaza ceasefire. The US government remains in shutdown. France struggles to form a new prime minister. China restricts rare earth exports. Ethiopia accuses Eritrea of preparing for war. El-Fasher faces a worsening humanitarian crisis. Europe confronts a heightened Russian threat. Spy trial collapse highlights government concerns. Mali experiences a persistent fuel shortage. U.S. Navy actions create diplomatic tensions. JP Morgan warns of stock market correction. The Federal Reserve faces economic uncertainty. Cambodia's MOU is under review by the government. Thailand seeks economic recovery through stimulus. Israel and Hamas reach agreement on Gaza ceasefire phase. Following intense diplomatic efforts, Israel and Hamas have reached an agreement to initiate the first phase of a potential ceasefire in Gaza, centered around the release of all remaining hostages held by the militant group. This development marks a significant, albeit preliminary, step toward de-escalating the ongoing conflict. Key figures across Israeli political spectrums have reacted to the news with varying degrees of optimism and cautious anticipation. President Isaac Herzog expressed profound relief, citing a biblical passage about the return of captives, while Defense Minister Israel Katz lauded the agreement as a huge blessing and extended gratitude to President Donald Trump for his leadership. Opposition leader Yair Lapid conveyed heartfelt anticipation for the return of hostages and their families. Benny Gantz, a former defense minister, echoed sentiments of hope and prayers for the safe return of all hostages, including fallen soldiers. The agreement focuses on the immediate release of all hostages currently held by Hamas in exchange for a pause in hostilities. While details of the broader ceasefire remain undefined, this initial phase represents a crucial step towards securing the release of the approximately 130 hostages taken during the October 7th attacks. President Donald Trump's role in brokering this agreement has been central. He has repeatedly expressed confidence in Hamas' willingness to negotiate and has actively pushed for a swift resolution. The White House has enthusiastically promoted the agreement, framing it as a big day and a potential turning point in the conflict. However, the agreement's long-term implications remain uncertain. Significant challenges remain, including the broader terms of a sustainable ceasefire and the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The immediate focus is on the safe return of the hostages and a temporary cessation of hostilities, but the path toward a lasting peace remains a distant prospect. The agreement represents a fragile beginning, contingent on the successful implementation of the hostage release and the subsequent negotiation of a comprehensive resolution. The government shutdown deepens as divisions explode. A protracted government shutdown intensified Wednesday as Republican and Democratic factions clashed over funding and key policy issues, primarily concerning healthcare costs and the handling of the ongoing political standoff. Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson faced mounting criticism for his strategy of demanding a Senate-approved stopgap funding bill before bringing the House back into session, a move seen by many as a stalling tactic. Marjorie Taylor Greene, a vocal Republican representative, forcefully challenged Johnson's approach, arguing that he should immediately convene the House to address rising healthcare premiums driven by the expiration of Enhanced Affordable Care Act subsidies. Greene emphasized the urgency of the situation, warning of significant financial hardship for millions of Americans. The core of the dispute revolves around the ACA subsidies, which are set to lapse at year's end, leading to anticipated increases in health insurance costs. Democrats insist on immediate action to extend these subsidies as a condition for reopening the government, while Republicans remain steadfast in their demand for a Senate-passed bill. Johnson's refusal to bring the House into session until the Senate acts has been widely criticized as a deliberate delay, fueling accusations of political maneuvering. Adding to the complexity, Greene's outspoken criticism of the government's handling of the situation, including her calls for a meeting between former President Donald Trump and victims of Jeffrey Epstein, further complicated negotiations. Greene's comments highlighted a growing rift within the Republican Party, particularly regarding policy stances on key issues. Furthermore, Greene criticized the Republican Party's framing of the shutdown as solely a Schumer problem, arguing that a proactive approach to negotiations was needed. The situation underscored the significant challenges in reaching a resolution, with both sides entrenched in their positions and seemingly unwilling to compromise. The exchange between Greene and House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries further escalated tensions, illustrating the depth of the political divisions. France's political crisis, a 48-hour window for a new prime minister. As of Wednesday evening, France remains gripped by political uncertainty following the resignation of Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu, leaving a 48-hour window for President Emmanuel Macron to nominate a new prime minister. The situation is characterized by a hung parliament, deep ideological divisions, and a pressing need to address France's crippling national debt, currently at nearly under 14% of GDP. The primary goal for Macron is to avoid fresh elections, a prospect that remains very real. Lecornu's resignation, triggered by opposition from the conservative Republicans, followed a period of intense negotiations with political parties. Despite 2 days of meetings, a consensus could not be reached, primarily due to disagreements over the government's budget and contentious pension reforms. Olivier Faure, leader of the Socialist Party, ruled out any possibility of joining a government led by Macron, citing the unacceptable nature of the proposed budget. Marine Le Pen, leader of the National Rally, vowed to vote down any new government, further complicating the prospects of forming a stable administration. Macron's strategy hinges on assembling a revitalized centrist cabinet, potentially incorporating elements from the Republicans, known as the Socle Commune, or a coalition with the Republicans. However, this remains uncertain, as the Republicans have ruled out joining a left-led government. National Assembly President Yael Braun-Pivet has cautioned against dissolving parliament, stating that it would not resolve the underlying issues. The key challenge remains the budget deficit, projected to hit 5.4% of GDP this year. A potential compromise suspending the pension reforms would incur significant financial costs. The situation is further complicated by the reluctance of key political factions to compromise and the looming threat of fresh elections if a government cannot be established within the allotted timeframe. The immediate focus is on Macron's ability to secure a viable coalition within the next 48 hours, a task that appears increasingly difficult given the entrenched positions of the various political parties. The next 48 hours will be critical in determining France's political future. China tightens rare earth export controls amid trade tensions. China has significantly escalated its control over the export of rare earths and related materials, primarily driven by ongoing trade negotiations with the United States. The country, which dominates the global processing of rare earths, accounting for approximately 90% of the world's supply, is employing these controls as a key bargaining tool ahead of a scheduled meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump. The formalization of these restrictions mandates that foreign companies now require explicit governmental approval before exporting products containing even minor quantities of rare earths, necessitating a detailed explanation of their intended use. This move extends beyond rare earths to include lithium batteries and specific forms of graphite, vital components within the global tech supply chain and largely produced in China. Beijing's stated rationale centers on safeguarding national security. Notably, the controls appear strategically targeted at overseas defense manufacturers, including those in the US, highlighting a deliberate effort to disrupt the supply of these materials. Previous restrictions, implemented in April, further amplified the impact, contributing to a global shortage. The regulations encompass restrictions on technology used in mining, smelting, separation, magnetic material manufacturing, and recycling of rare earths. Crucially, the export of production equipment and the assembly, debugging, maintenance, repair, and upgrading of related technology is now prohibited without government authorization. This mirrors similar U.S. restrictions on chip-making equipment exports to China, aimed at hindering China's advancements in artificial intelligence and military applications. Trade expert Alex Capri suggests the timing of these regulations is specifically linked to the upcoming Xi-Trump meeting. China's actions represent a targeted response to vulnerabilities in U.S. electronics and weapons manufacturing, mirroring earlier American efforts to constrain China's chip industry. The implications are substantial, particularly for the U.S., which possesses a significant rare earths mining industry, but lacks the necessary processing infrastructure. The new regulations demonstrate China's determination to maintain its dominance in this strategically important sector. Ethiopia accuses Eritrea of preparing for war amid Red Sea tensions. Rising tensions between Ethiopia and Eritrea are escalating, fueled by Ethiopia's accusation that Eritrea is preparing for war and actively destabilizing the country. This accusation, detailed in a letter to UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres by Ethiopian Foreign Minister Gideon Timotheus, centers on Eritrea's alleged collusion with a hardline faction of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, to wage war against Ethiopia. The letter highlights concerns about Eritrea funding, mobilizing, and directing armed groups, particularly within Ethiopia's Amhara region, where the Fano militias are battling the federal government. The conflict stems from Ethiopia's desire to regain access to the Red Sea. a strategic goal that has long been a point of contention following Eritrea's control of the coastline at independence in 1993. Ethiopia argues it relinquished control of ports in error. The situation is further complicated by ongoing instability within Ethiopia, specifically the conflict in the Amhara region where the Fano militias, initially allied with Abiy Ahmed's government against the TPLF, are now actively seeking to topple the government and were implicated in the attempted capture of Woldia. Eritrea's involvement is seen as a direct response to Ethiopia's perceived threat to gain Red Sea access. The TPLF, led by Debretsion Gebremichael, controls the Tigray region and accuses Abiy's government of failing to fully implement the 2022 peace deal. Furthermore, Eritrea is accused of forming an alliance with the Debretsion-led TPLF faction. Eritrea's Information Minister Yemaine Gebremichael dismissed Ethiopia's concerns as too crass and pathetic to sell, criticizing the ruling party's obsession with the Red Sea and River Nile. The situation is further complicated by the ongoing conflict within Ethiopia and the involvement of various factions, including the Fano militias and the TPLF, creating a complex and volatile security landscape. Ethiopia emphasized the strategic importance of the Red Sea and River Nile to its existence, leading to a sharp rebuke from Eritrea. The conflict underscores deep-seated historical grievances and ongoing political instability within the region. El-Fasher under siege escalating crisis in situation in El-Fasher, Sudan, continues to deteriorate dramatically, marked by escalating violence and a deepening humanitarian crisis. The Rapid Support Forces, RSF, have maintained a 17-month siege of the city, trapping hundreds of thousands of civilians and causing widespread starvation and destruction. Recent events highlight the severity of the crisis. On Tuesday, the Saudi hospital suffered a second attack this year, resulting in 13 deaths, including a doctor and nurse, and 16 injuries from shelling. Sudanese medics have condemned the attack as a war crime. The RSF's intensified assault on El-Fasher, coupled with the construction of a 57-kilometer earthen wall, revealed by satellite imagery analyzed by Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab, has effectively sealed off all major exit routes. This siege has resulted in civilians facing extortion, arbitrary detentions, disappearances, and sexual violence at RSF checkpoints. The relentless fighting has forced the closure of nearly all health facilities, severely hindering access to vital medical care. Previous attacks, including one in January that killed 3 children and injured others, demonstrate the RSF's disregard for civilian life. Experts believe El-Fasher is on the verge of a catastrophic outcome unless immediate reinforcements arrive for the army. The ongoing conflict, now exceeding 2 years, constitutes the world's worst humanitarian crisis, accounting for tens of thousands of deaths. Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, warned last Thursday that the city is on the precipice of an even greater catastrophe if immediate action isn't taken to alleviate the siege and protect civilians. The blockade and continued hostilities are exacerbating the already dire conditions, threatening a significant escalation of the humanitarian disaster unfolding in El-Fasher. Aid convoys are consistently blocked, further compounding the suffering of the trapped population. Europe grapples with rising Russian threat, a new era of uncertainty. Recent airspace incursions by suspected Russian drones and warplanes across NATO nations have sparked widespread concern in Europe, signaling a shift towards a gray zone of heightened instability. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz's warning of a new age of uncertainty reflects a growing realization that traditional notions of peace are no longer assured. The incidents, coupled with cyber attacks and infrastructure vulnerabilities, highlight a significant readiness gap within European defenses. Key figures, including former NATO Chief George Robertson and Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski, emphasize the need for proactive measures, warning of potential sabotage, and the unpreparedness of civilian infrastructure. Robertson's analogy of boiling a frog underscores the urgency of addressing this threat before it becomes irreversible. The United States' response remains a critical and somewhat ambiguous factor. President Donald Trump's skepticism and fluctuating relationship with Russia have introduced further uncertainty, raising questions about the extent of U.S. security guarantees and potential escalation. Trump's comments regarding NATO's response to the incidents have fueled anxieties and highlighted the need for a coordinated, decisive approach. Several European nations are responding with increased defense spending, rearmament efforts, and the development of strategies to counter gray zone warfare. Poland, for example, is deploying F-35s to intercept drones, while Ukraine is providing training to NATO forces. The situation has prompted a broader conversation about the resilience of European societies and the need for all-of-country defense strategies. Experts warn that Russia's strategic goal is to test the limits of NATO's commitment and to exploit divisions within the alliance. The potential for escalation remains a significant concern, particularly given Russia's demonstrated capabilities and willingness to operate in this ambiguous space. Ultimately, the events underscore the need for a fundamental shift in European security thinking, requiring greater cooperation, investment, and a proactive approach to deterring and mitigating threats in the evolving landscape of hybrid warfare. The situation demands a coordinated response to prevent a potentially catastrophic outcome. Collapse of spy trial blamed on government hesitation regarding China's threat level. The prosecution of Christopher Cash and Christopher Berry, accused of spying for China, collapsed due to the government's failure to formally label China as a national security threat, according to the UK's Director of Public Prosecutions, Stephen Parkinson. The case, initiated in April 2024, hinged on evidence gathered between December 2021 and February 2023, but the lack of a government declaration regarding China's status as a threat prevented further prosecution. This outcome mirrors a similar situation involving 6 Bulgarian nationals convicted under the Official Secrets Act for spying for Russia, where the prosecution successfully demonstrated China's representation as a threat. The DPP's intervention followed months of unsuccessful attempts to obtain crucial witness statements, highlighting the government's reluctance to explicitly acknowledge the perceived threat. Parkinson emphasized that efforts to secure this evidence were made over many months without success, citing that no statements emerged confirming China's threat status at the time of the alleged offenses. The precedent set by the Bulgarian case solidified the requirement for such a declaration. Legal commentators, including former DPP Lord MacDonald, criticized the government's handling of the situation, demanding a public explanation. Former MI5 head Ken McCallum previously stated that China's espionage activities were a sustained campaign of epic scale, and a parliamentary report indicated China's penetration across the UK economy. Former Intelligence and Security Committee Chairman Dominic Grieve stated that the collapse stemmed from a failure to focus on proving China's enemy status in court. The case's collapse occurred just days before its scheduled start, generating considerable expectation. Legal experts suggest the government's hesitation stemmed from a desire to avoid potentially damaging statements regarding British national interests. The situation underscores the complexities of prosecuting national security cases and the critical role of government declarations in establishing a legal framework. The collapse has prompted calls for greater transparency and accountability regarding the government's assessment of China's threat level. Mali faces ongoing fuel crisis amidst jihadist blockade. A persistent fuel crisis continues to grip Mali, primarily stemming from a blockade imposed by al-Qaeda-linked Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, JNM. The blockade, involving the ambush and burning of fuel tankers on key highways linking Mali to its neighbors, has caused widespread shortages and economic disruption across the country. Bamako, the capital, is particularly affected, with long queues forming at petrol stations and businesses grinding to a halt. Motorbike taxi drivers have reported arduous journeys, pushing their vehicles for fuel, highlighting the severity of the situation. The crisis is compounded by Mali's landlocked status, relying entirely on road imports from neighboring countries like Senegal and Ivory Coast. The military junta, which seized power 5 years ago, is now employing Russian mercenaries instead of the previously deployed UN peacekeeping force and French counter-terror units. Despite initial popular support, the ongoing jihadist insurgency, particularly the actions of JNM, has destabilized much of the north and east of the country. Fuel prices have soared, with some areas experiencing increases of over 200%, impacting businesses like fish vendors who struggle to refrigerate their goods. The situation is further aggravated by frequent power cuts, reducing electricity supply to just 6 hours a day in certain areas. Negotiations are underway between Malian officials and JNM, with demands including the release of captured fighters and a relaxation of fuel restrictions. A key element of the blockade involves a ban on fuel sales outside service stations in rural areas, aimed at limiting the group's supplies. The government has implemented an action plan, deploying teams to enforce state-capped prices, and expresses hope for improvement in the coming days. However, the crisis underscores the continued challenge posed by the jihadist insurgency and its impact on the country's stability and economy. The situation is being monitored closely, with ongoing efforts to secure fuel supplies and address the underlying security concerns. U.S. Navy strikes spark diplomatic crisis with Colombia. Recent U.S. Navy strikes in the Caribbean, resulting in the deaths of 21 individuals aboard 4 vessels, have triggered a significant diplomatic crisis with Colombia. U.S. President Donald Trump initially confirmed the strikes on October 3rd via Truth Social, while the U.S. Senate narrowly rejected a measure requiring congressional approval for such actions. Despite lacking evidence or specific details regarding the vessels and their occupants, the strikes have drawn widespread condemnation from regional nations due to concerns over breaches of international law. Colombian President Gustavo Petro vehemently disputed the U.S. narrative, asserting that the last boat targeted was carrying Colombian citizens. He characterized the situation as opening a new war scenario in the Caribbean. Petro demanded that the families of the deceased come forward to report their identities, arguing that the strikes represent a war for oil and an aggression against Latin America and the Caribbean. The White House swiftly dismissed Petro's claims as baseless and reprehensible, reaffirming the U.S. commitment to regional security and cooperation, despite the policy differences. The Senate's rejection of the congressional approval measure highlights the growing political pressure surrounding the military actions. Furthermore, a leaked memo revealed the U.S. government's classification of the situation as a non-international armed conflict, a move likely intended to justify the use of wartime powers, including targeting cartels like those operating in Mexico, Ecuador, and Venezuela, which have been designated as terrorist organizations. This designation grants U.S. authorities expanded powers in their response. President Petro has called for a meeting of Caribbean foreign ministers to address the strikes. The U.S. maintains that the strikes were aimed at disrupting drug trafficking operations off the Venezuelan coast. The situation remains tense, with both nations grappling with differing interpretations of events and escalating tensions in the region. The core issue revolves around the legitimacy of the U.S. military actions and their impact on Colombian citizens. J.P. Morgan CEO warns of U.S. stock market correction. Jamie Dimon, CEO of J.P. Morgan, has expressed significant concerns regarding a potential serious fall in U.S. stock markets, stating he is far more worried than others about a correction expected within the next 6 to 2 years. This assessment comes amidst heightened global uncertainty stemming from geopolitical factors, increased fiscal spending, and the remilitarization of the world. Dimon highlighted the impact of variables such as the current investment boom in artificial intelligence, AI, drawing parallels to past technological bubbles like the dot-com era, predicting that substantial investment in AI could lead to significant losses. Speaking exclusively to the BBC, Dimon emphasized the need for increased military investment, advocating for stockpiling bullets, guns and bombs as a more reliable strategy for mitigating risk compared to investing in volatile assets like cryptocurrency. He underscored the importance of recognizing the increasingly dangerous global landscape. Dimon's warning aligns with recent observations from the Bank of England, which similarly cautioned about the inflated valuations of AI technology companies. The interview took place in Bournemouth, where Dimon announced a substantial investment of approximately $350 million in JP Morgan's campus and a further $3.5 million in philanthropic initiatives supporting local nonprofits. Chancellor Rachel Reeves praised the investment as fantastic news for the Dorset economy. Dimon's remarks reflect a cautious outlook on the U.S. economy and the broader global financial environment, suggesting a reassessment of investment strategies in light of escalating risks. He maintained confidence in the Federal Reserve's independence despite recent challenges. The CEO's perspective is a critical warning for investors and policymakers alike, urging a more realistic appraisal of market conditions and potential vulnerabilities. The Fed's uncertain path amidst economic turbulence. The Federal Reserve continues to grapple with persistent inflation despite previous rate hikes, complicated by ongoing economic uncertainties stemming largely from former President Trump's policies. While the Fed has successfully slowed inflation, it faces a challenging dual mandate of maintaining full employment while combating rising prices. Trump's trade wars and other policy shifts have introduced significant economic turbulence, hindering the Fed's efforts. The core issue lies in the lingering impact of Trump's trade policies, which have driven up certain prices and created economic instability. This, combined with other policy changes, has created a tug-of-war for the economy. The Fed's attempts to navigate this situation are further complicated by a data blackout due to a government shutdown, limiting the information available to inform policy decisions. The Fed's initial strategy of aggressive rate hikes proved effective in curbing inflation, but the economic fallout remains. Job growth has been tepid, particularly among young people and minorities, and unemployment has risen. The Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, the Fed's preferred inflation measure, has shown signs of slowing but remains above the 2% target. Trump's attempts to influence the Fed's decisions, including pressuring members to resign and openly criticizing Fed Chair Jerome Powell, have further heightened the uncertainty. He has advocated for aggressive rate cuts, creating a potential conflict with the Fed's independent decision-making process. The situation is exacerbated by a bifurcated economy, with higher-income consumers maintaining their spending while lower-income households are forced to cut back and rely on cheaper alternatives. The housing market remains strained by low supply, high prices, and elevated mortgage rates. Despite these challenges, the Fed is expected to continue lowering interest rates, albeit cautiously, to prevent further economic deterioration and support employment. However, the path forward remains unclear, and the central bank faces a complex balancing act, protecting its independence, while mitigating the risks of both inflation and unemployment, amidst a period of significant economic disruption and political interference. The data blackout and the ongoing influence of the former president add another layer of complexity to the Fed's already difficult task. Government's right to revoke MOU with Cambodia. The Thai government possesses legal justification to terminate the Memorandum of Understanding 43s, MOU 43s, with Cambodia, according to Panthip Popongpan of the Thailand Watch Foundation. He argues this revocation is permissible under Section 60 of the 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, specifically due to significant breaches of the agreement by Cambodian forces. Recent incidents involving alleged military weaponry and explosive device usage on Thai territory are presented as concrete evidence of these violations. Popongpan strongly opposes the government's proposed public referendum on the issue, asserting that it would unduly burden the next government and produce unreliable, non-binding results. He intends to campaign for the repeal of MOU 43, emphasizing the protection of Thailand's sovereignty and the necessity for fair, modern negotiations with Cambodia. The Foundation's stance rests on the historical precedent of clearly defined Thai borders established during the reign of King Rama V, utilizing natural watershed lines, such as cliff ridges between Chongbok in Ubon Ratchathani and Chongsangam in Sisaket. He highlights that Thailand and Cambodia coexisted for over a century without the MOU. Popongpan criticizes Cambodia's reliance on a 1 cent 200,000 French colonial map, which he contends unfairly disadvantages Thailand. He dismisses concerns that canceling MOU 43 would trigger a case at the International Court of Justice, noting Thailand's withdrawal from the ICJ in 1960. Instead, he advocates utilizing existing negotiation mechanisms, the Thai-Cambodian Joint Boundary Commission, Regional Border Committee, and General Border Committee. Furthermore, he rejects third-party mediation, believing direct dialogue through established channels offers the most viable path toward resolving the border dispute. The core argument remains that upholding Thailand's sovereignty demands immediate action based on legal grounds and historical context, rather than a politically driven referendum. Thailand grapples with economic lag, prioritizes stimulus and reform. Thailand's Prime Minister Anutin Charnvirakul has expressed deep concern over the nation's economic performance, describing the gap with Vietnam as a nightmare, and emphasizing the urgent need for a strategic reset. Speaking at the Economic Reporters Association's seminar, Anutin highlighted the country's resilience, while acknowledging the challenge of maintaining growth momentum. He underscored the importance of bolstering the industrial and agricultural sectors, alongside promoting domestic investment and a stable tax base, particularly given Thailand's aging population. The government is actively considering extending the retirement age for civil servants, reflecting increased longevity and the associated financial burdens. Simultaneously, the administration is accelerating its commitment to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, 15 years ahead of the initial target, aiming to enhance the competitiveness of Thai exports. This involves expediting the enactment of the Clean Air Act and the Climate Change Act. Finance Minister Ekneti Nithan Prapus echoed Anutin's concerns, stressing the critical need for immediate economic stimulus due to projected slow growth figures 3% for the first half, 1.7% for Q3, and only 0.3% for Q4. He acknowledged the administration's limited 4-month tenure and the subsequent challenges. Historically, Thailand's economy experienced high growth before 1997, followed by a decline and subsequent stagnation, largely due to low investment levels, which had dropped to 23% of GDP after 1997 compared to 40% previously. The government plans to implement weekly stimulus measures, including debt resolution and liquidity support for small businesses. Furthermore, the Finance Ministry is revising the medium-term fiscal framework by November, a move intended to address concerns raised by credit rating agencies and ensure transparency in revenue, expenditure, and public debt management. Nithan Prapus stated that while achieving all desired outcomes within the 4-month timeframe might be difficult due to legislative amendments, the government remains committed to enacting necessary reforms to drive economic recovery and regain lost ground. Israeli government assesses difficulty of returning all hostage remains. Israeli intelligence assessments indicate that Hamas may not be able to locate and return all the remaining deceased hostages held in Gaza, complicating efforts to finalize a ceasefire agreement. 3 Israeli sources revealed that the government has known for months that Hamas lacks knowledge of the whereabouts of some deceased hostages, with the number believed to be in single figures, a shift from earlier estimates. Negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh highlighted Israel's demand for the return of all hostages, both living and dead, as a condition for ending the war. The United States has also been aware of the issue, with officials acknowledging Hamas's limited control over some hostage-holding factions. Barbara Leaf, Assistant Secretary of State for Middle Eastern Affairs, stated that Hamas has not had control over all hostages from the outset. While recovery of living hostages remains the primary focus, the uncertainty surrounding the deceased poses a significant challenge. Israeli officials believe Hamas may use this uncertainty to delay ceasefire implementation or demand a full Israeli military withdrawal. Concerns exist that Prime Minister Netanyahu could exploit this situation to derail negotiations. However, given intense American and regional pressure, it's more likely Netanyahu will use the issue as leverage for final agreement details. A joint task force involving Israel, the United States, Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey will be established to locate the remains of the missing hostages. This effort reflects Israel's commitment to returning all those lost in conflict, echoing previous unresolved cases like Lieutenant Hedar Golden's and Ron Arad's disappearances, which have become enduring symbols of Israel's struggle to account for all its soldiers. Nathan Eshel, a close confidant of Netanyahu, recently expressed a pessimistic view, suggesting that some bodies may never be returned, mirroring the prolonged difficulties surrounding past missing soldier cases. The situation is particularly sensitive within Israeli society, fueled by the unresolved fate of Golden and Arad, highlighting the complex and emotionally charged nature of hostage negotiations. The establishment of the task force represents a pragmatic response to the challenges presented by the uncertain status of the deceased hostages.